The small figure huddled beneath the wooden awning of the general store had been there since sunset. And now the stars burned cold and bright overhead while frost gathered on the wooden planks of Custer's Main Street. Xavier Emerson had been riding for 3 days straight, pushing his mare harder than he should have, trying to outrun memories that clung to him like prairie dust. The November wind of 1879 cut through his coat as he guided his horse down the main street of Custer, South Dakota, a town he had never visited before, but had heard mentioned by other cattlemen passing through Montana. The settlement was small, maybe 200 souls if you counted generously, with false-fronted buildings lining a wide dirt road that turned to mud when it rained and froze solid when winter came early like it had this year. His intention had been to ride straight through to the boarding house at the end of town, get a hot meal and a bed, then move on in the morning. But something caught his eye as he passed the general store, a shape too small and still to be a dog or a drunk sleeping off whiskey. Xavier pulled his mare to a halt and dismounted, his boots hitting the frozen ground with a dull thud. He approached slowly, one hand resting on the pistol at his hip out of habit rather than suspicion. As he got closer, he could see it was a child, a girl maybe 8 or 9 years old, wrapped in a thin shawl that did nothing against the biting cold. Her dark hair hung in 2 braids down her back, and her face was turned toward the street as if she was watching for something or someone. Xavier crouched down beside her, keeping his movements gentle so as not to startle her. "Hey there, little one," he said, his voice rough from days without much talking. "You all right?" The girl turned to look at him with eyes that seemed too old for her young face. She did not flinch or pull away, just studied him with a solemn expression that made Xavier's chest tighten. She was shivering, he could see that now, her whole body trembling like a leaf in the wind. "Who were you waiting for out here?" Xavier asked, glancing up and down the empty street. Nothing moved except for the swinging sign above the saloon 3 doors down. The girl's lips were nearly blue with cold, and when she tried to speak, her teeth chattered so hard she could barely get the words out. "My sister," she finally managed. "She said she would come back for me. She promised." Xavier felt something crack open inside his chest, some wall he had built up over the past year starting to crumble. He shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around the girl's thin shoulders. It swallowed her completely, but at least it would keep her from freezing to death while he figured out what to do. "How long have you been waiting here?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from the way frost had formed on her eyelashes. "Since the sun went down," she said, pulling his coat tighter around herself. "But she has not come yet. Maybe she got lost. The town is bigger than where we came from." Xavier looked around again, taking in the handful of buildings that made up Custer's downtown. It was hardly big enough to get lost in, which meant either the sister was not coming or something had happened to prevent her return. Neither option sat well with him. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lily," she said. "Lily Harper. My sister is Mary Harper. She is 19 and she has brown hair and she is very pretty, and she sings sometimes when she thinks nobody is listening." "Well, Lily Harper, I am Xavier Emerson, and I think we should get you somewhere warm while we figure out where your sister might be. Have you eaten anything today?" Lily shook her head, and Xavier noticed for the first time how hollow her cheeks looked, how her eyes had that glazed quality that came from hunger and cold combined. He stood and offered her his hand. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, her small fingers like ice even through his glove. The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who took one look at Lily and ushered them both inside with the kind of efficient kindness that came from years of mothering. Within minutes, Lily was seated at the kitchen table with a bowl of hot stew in front of her and a blanket wrapped around her shoulders on top of Xavier's coat. Mrs. Patterson, a plump woman in her 50s with gray hair pinned back in a severe bun, poured coffee for Xavier and sat down across from him with an expectant look. "Found her outside the general store," Xavier explained, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Says she has been waiting for her sister since sunset. Mary Harper," she said. "You know anyone by that name?" Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted, something like recognition mixed with concern crossing her face. "Mary Harper," she repeated slowly. "Yes, I know her. She came through here about a week ago, looking for work. Pretty thing, brown hair, quiet-spoken. I told her the saloon was hiring, but she said she would rather scrub floors than work in a place like that. Where is she now?" Xavier asked, though part of him already suspected the answer would not be simple. "That is the thing," Mrs. Patterson said, lowering her voice even though Lily was focused entirely on her stew. "She took a position at the Whitmore Ranch, about 5 miles east of town. They needed someone to help with cooking and cleaning. She was supposed to come back to town yesterday to pick up her little sister from the wagon train station, but she never showed." Xavier felt tension creep up his spine. "You think something happened to her? Could be she just could not get away. The Whitmores are good people, but they work their help hard, and with winter coming on there is always more to do than there are hours in the day. Or could be the weather kept her out there. We had snow yesterday morning, not much but enough to make the roads tricky. Or could be something else," Xavier said quietly. Mrs. Patterson met his eyes and nodded slowly. "Or could be something else." Xavier drained his coffee and stood. "I will ride out there in the morning, see what I can find out." "In the morning?" Mrs. Patterson raised an eyebrow. "Young man, you look like you have been rode hard and put away wet. When is the last time you slept in a real bed?" Xavier could not remember, which was probably answer enough. "I will be fine. The girl can stay here tonight," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "I have got a spare room and she needs rest more than anything. You get some sleep, and we will sort this out come daylight." Xavier wanted to argue, wanted to saddle up right then and ride out to the Whitmore Ranch, but his body was betraying him, exhaustion weighing down his limbs like lead. He nodded reluctantly, and Mrs. Patterson showed him to a small room on the second floor with a narrow bed and a washstand. He barely managed to pull off his boots before collapsing onto the mattress and falling into a deep, dreamless sleep. Morning came too bright and too cold, sunlight streaming through the thin curtains to wake Xavier before he was ready. He dressed quickly, splashed icy water on his face from the basin, and headed downstairs to find Lily already awake and sitting at the kitchen table. She looked marginally better than she had the night before, color back in her cheeks and her eyes clearer, but there was still that worried tension in the way she held herself. "Did my sister come?" she asked immediately when she saw Xavier. "Not yet," he said gently, sitting down beside her. "But I am going to ride out to where she is working and bring her back. I promise." Lily studied him with those two old eyes. "Do you keep your promises?" The question hit harder than it should have. Xavier thought about all the promises he had made over the years, to his mother before she died, to the woman he had almost married before she chose someone else, to himself about the kind of man he would be. Some he had kept, some he had broken, and some had broken him instead. "I keep the ones that matter," he said finally, and it was the truth. Mrs. Patterson provided him with directions to the Whitmore Ranch and a cloth sack filled with biscuits and dried beef for the ride. Xavier saddled his mare, checked his rifle and pistol out of habit, and set out east as the sun climbed higher in a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The snow from 2 days before still clung to the shadowed places beneath trees and in the lee of hills, but the road was clear enough for riding. The Whitmore ranch sat in a shallow valley with a creek running through it. The main house a solid 2-story structure built from local timber with a wide porch wrapping around the front. There were several outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, and what looked like a chicken coop. Cattle grazed in the fields beyond, hardy breeds that could survive the brutal South Dakota winters. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Xavier could see a figure moving around in the yard, an older man in work clothes carrying a bucket toward the barn. Xavier rode up slowly, making sure he was seen well before he got too close. The man set down his bucket and waited, one hand resting on his hip near where a pistol would be if he was carrying one. As Xavier drew nearer, he could make out the man's features, weathered and lined from years of outdoor work, with a gray beard and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Morning," Xavier called out, reining his horse to a stop a respectful distance away. "I am looking for the Whitmore place." "You found it," the man said. His voice was gruff but not unfriendly. "I am James Whitmore. What can I do for you?" "Name is Xavier Emerson. I am here about Mary Harper, the woman you hired to help around the place. Her little sister is in town waiting for her, has been waiting since yesterday. I wanted to make sure everything is all right." Something shifted in Whitmore's expression, a flicker of discomfort or maybe guilt. "Mary," he said slowly. "Yes, she has been working here. Good worker, keeps to herself mostly. Is she here now? Can I speak with her?" Whitmore hesitated, and in that hesitation, Xavier felt the first real spike of alarm. "She is here, but there is a situation. Maybe you should come inside, talk to my wife about it." Xavier dismounted and followed Whitmore into the house, which was warm and smelled like fresh bread and coffee. The interior was well kept, with simple furniture and a few homey touches, embroidered samplers on the walls and curtains at the windows. A woman was working in the kitchen, tall and thin with blonde hair going gray at the temples. She looked up when they entered, and Xavier saw the same discomfort in her face that he had seen in her husband's. "Margaret, this is Xavier Emerson," Whitmore said. "He is here about Mary." Margaret Whitmore wiped her hands on her apron and came forward, her expression troubled. "Did her sister send you?" In a manner of speaking, Xavier said. "I found the girl half frozen outside the general store last night, waiting for Mary to come back for her. What is going on?" Margaret exchanged a look with her husband before answering. "Mary came to work for us last week like we agreed. She was a hard worker, never complained, did everything we asked and more. But 3 days ago my son came home." "Your son?" Xavier felt his jaw tighten. "Thomas," Margaret said, and there was something like shame in her voice. "He is our youngest, just turned 23. He has been working on a ranch down in Wyoming for the past 2 years, learning the business. He came home unexpectedly, said he wanted to see family before winter set in too hard." "And," Xavier prompted when she hesitated. "And he took a liking to Mary," James Whitmore said bluntly. "Started following her around, making comments, trying to get her alone. We talked to him about it, told him to leave her be, but he did not listen. Then yesterday morning, Mary said she needed to go to town to pick up her sister. Thomas offered to drive her in the wagon." Xavier felt ice in his veins. "And they never made it to town." "They made it," Margaret said quickly. "Or at least, Thomas did. He came back alone around noon, said he had dropped Mary off in town and she would make her own way back. But when evening came and she had not returned, I started to worry. Then this morning, Thomas let slip that he had not actually taken her all the way into town, that they had an argument and she had gotten out of the wagon a mile or so down the road and walked the rest of the way. She probably never made it to town at all," Xavier said, anger building in his chest. "Where is your son now?" "Out checking fences in the north pasture," James said. "Look, Mr. Emerson, I know how this sounds, but Thomas is not a bad boy. He is just young and foolish and does not think before he acts. If something happened to that girl, if she got lost or hurt because he left her on the road, we will make it right. But I do not think he would have done anything to harm her deliberately." Xavier bit back the harsh words that wanted to come out. These were decent people, he could see that, but they were also parents trying to believe the best of their son even when the evidence suggested otherwise. "I need to search the road between here and town," he said. "If she walked, there might be tracks, signs of where she went." "I will come with you," James offered. "Margaret, you stay here in case Mary shows up on her own." They rode out together, Xavier and James, retracing the road that connected the ranch to Custer. The morning was clear and cold, the air so crisp it felt like it might shatter if you hit it hard enough. Xavier kept his eyes on the ground, looking for anything that might indicate a woman traveling on foot, disturbed snow, a dropped item, anything at all. They were about a mile from the ranch when Xavier spotted something off to the side of the road, a dark shape partially hidden by brush. He dismounted quickly and pushed through the scrub, James right behind him. What he found made his blood run cold. It was a shawl, thin and brown, caught on a branch and fluttering in the wind. Xavier lifted it carefully, examining the fabric. There was no blood, no obvious signs of violence, but the fact that it was here at all meant something had gone wrong. No woman would abandon a shawl in this weather unless she had been running or fighting or forced to leave it behind. "That is Mary's," James said quietly, his face pale. "I have seen her wearing it." Xavier looked around more carefully now, and after a moment he spotted them, footprints in the snow leading away from the road and up into the hills. They were small prints, definitely made by a woman, and they were spaced far apart as if she had been running. His eyes followed the trail until it disappeared into the pine trees that covered the hillside. "She went into the woods," he said, pointing. "Something scared her off the road, made her run." "Could have been an animal," James suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "We have got mountain lions up in those hills and wolves sometimes." "Could have been," Xavier agreed, though he did not believe it. He remounted and started following the tracks, James staying close behind. The trail wound upward through the trees, becoming harder to follow as the snow thinned beneath the pine canopy. Several times, Xavier had to dismount and search on foot, looking for broken branches or disturbed leaves that might indicate someone had passed through. They had been searching for over an hour when Xavier heard it, a faint sound that might have been wind through the trees or might have been something else. He held up a hand to stop James and listened carefully. There it was again, a soft voice, almost too quiet to hear, coming from somewhere ahead and to the left. Xavier moved in that direction as quietly as he could, leading his horse by the reins. The trees opened up into a small clearing, and there, huddled at the base of a large pine tree with her arms wrapped around her knees, was a young woman. Her brown hair was tangled with pine needles and her dress was torn at the hem, but she was alive. "Mary Harper." Xavier called softly, not wanting to startle her. The woman's head snapped up, and Xavier found himself looking into a pair of large, frightened eyes. She tried to scramble backward, pressing herself against the tree trunk. "It is all right," Xavier said quickly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "Your sister sent me, Lily. She is safe in town waiting for you." At the mention of her sister's name, some of the panic left Mary's face. "Lily, she is all right. She is fine. Cold and scared, but fine. Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house is looking after her." Mary's shoulders sagged with relief, and then suddenly she was crying, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. Xavier moved closer carefully and crouched down beside her, pulling off his coat for the second time in as many days and draping it over her shoulders. She was freezing. He could feel it even through the fabric of her dress, and her lips had that same blue tinge that Lily's had shown the night before. "We need to get you warm," he said gently. "Can you ride?" Mary nodded, wiping at her face with shaking hands. "I can ride." "I am sorry. I am just so cold and so tired, and I was so scared about Lily, about what would happen to her if I did not make it back." "What happened?" Xavier asked. "Why did you run into the woods?" Mary's eyes slid past him to where James Whitmore was hanging back, still mounted on his horse. Fear flickered across her face again, and Xavier understood immediately. "It was not James," he said quietly. "It was his son, was it not? Thomas." Mary nodded slowly. "He offered to take me to town to get Lily. I thought it was kind of him. But once we were on the road, he started saying things, terrible things about what he wanted to do to me. I told him to stop, told him I was not interested, but he would not listen. Then he grabbed my arm and tried to pull me close, and I panicked. I jumped out of the wagon while it was still moving and ran. I did not know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from him." Fury burned in Xavier's chest, hot and fierce. He looked back at James, who had heard every word and whose face had gone ashen. "I am sorry," James said, his voice thick with shame. "I am so sorry. I knew he was bothering you, but I did not think he would do something like this. I should have sent him away the moment you complained." "Yes, you should have," Xavier said coldly. "But right now, we need to get Mary back to town. You can deal with your son however you see fit, but I am taking Mary and her sister and making sure they get somewhere safe." James nodded miserably. "I will pay for their lodging at the boarding house for as long as they need. And I will pay Mary the wages she is owed, plus extra for what my son put her through. It is the least I can do." Xavier helped Mary to her feet and onto his horse, then mounted behind her. She was shivering so hard she could barely hold on, so he wrapped one arm around her waist to keep her steady and took the reins in his other hand. The ride back to town was slow, Xavier not wanting to jostle Mary any more than necessary. She leaned back against him, exhausted and cold, and he could feel each shiver that ran through her body. By the time they reached Custer, it was past noon and the sun was high overhead. Mrs. Patterson met them at the door of the boarding house with Lily right behind her, and the moment Lily saw her sister, she let out a cry and rushed forward. Xavier helped Mary dismount and steadied her as Lily threw her arms around her waist, both of them crying now. "I knew you would come," Lily said between sobs. "I knew you would not leave me." "Never," Mary said fiercely, hugging her sister tight. "I would never leave you, Lily. Never." Mrs. Patterson ushered them inside, and Xavier followed, feeling suddenly exhausted now that the crisis was over. James Whitmore had ridden up behind them and dismounted heavily, looking like he had aged 10 years in the past few hours. "I will make sure Thomas faces consequences for what he did," James said to Mary, "and I will send over the money I owe you this afternoon. Again, I am deeply sorry." Mary looked at him for a long moment, and Xavier could see her weighing her anger against her exhaustion. Finally, she just nodded. "I appreciate that, Mr. Whitmore, but I do not want to see you or your son again. Please just send the money with someone else." James nodded and left, his shoulders bowed under the weight of his shame. Mrs. Patterson got Mary settled in a chair by the fire with hot tea and a blanket, while Lily stayed pressed against her sister's side as if afraid she might disappear if she let go. Xavier stood awkwardly in the doorway, suddenly unsure of his place in all this. He had done what he promised, found Mary and brought her safely back to her sister. The logical thing would be to get a good night's sleep and then move on in the morning, continue the drifting that had defined his life for the past year. But something kept him rooted in place, some feeling he could not quite name. Mary looked up at him, her eyes still red from crying but clearer now. "Thank you," she said softly. "I do not know what would have happened to Lily if you had not found her, or what would have happened to me if you had not come looking." "Just glad I was passing through," Xavier said, and it was the truth. Out of all the towns he could have ridden into, all the roads he could have taken, something had led him to Custer at exactly the moment Lily needed help. He did not believe much in divine providence, had seen too much hardship and cruelty for that, but maybe sometimes things worked out the way they were supposed to. "Will you stay for lunch?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "It is the least we can offer after what you have done." Xavier nodded, and found himself sitting at the same table where he had sat with Lily the night before, eating thick slices of bread with butter and cold chicken left over from the previous evening's dinner. Mary picked at her food, still shaken from her ordeal, but Lily ate with the focused intensity of a child who had gone too long without a proper meal. As they ate, the story came out in pieces. Mary and Lily were orphans, their parents dead from cholera 3 years ago in Kansas. They had been staying with an aunt who made it clear she saw them as burdens rather than family. And when the aunt announced she was remarrying and her new husband did not want children underfoot, Mary had made the decision to strike out on her own. She had heard that the Dakota Territory had opportunities for those willing to work hard. And at 19, she was old enough to find employment as a cook or housekeeper or any number of positions that respectable young women could take. The journey had been harder than expected, their money running low before they reached South Dakota. Mary had found work in a few towns along the way, but never anything stable, never anything that paid enough for her to afford lodging for both herself and Lily. When they reached Custer, Mary had used the last of their funds to buy Lily a ticket on a wagon train heading west, with the plan that Mary would work for a few weeks at the Whitmore Ranch, save up some money, and then come back for her sister. It had seemed like a good plan, a safe plan, until Thomas Whitmore decided Mary was something he could take. "What will you do now?" Xavier asked when the story was finished. Mary shook her head slowly. "I do not know. I have enough money to stay here for a little while, thanks to what Mr. Whitmore will pay me. But I will need to find more work eventually, and I am not sure anyone in this town will hire me once they hear what happened. People always find a way to blame the woman in situations like this." Xavier knew she was right. He had seen it play out that way too many times, women blamed for the violence done to them, their reputations destroyed while the men who hurt them faced little or no consequences. It made him sick, but it was the way the world worked. "You could always move on to another town," he suggested. "Start fresh somewhere nobody knows the story." "Maybe," Mary said, but she sounded defeated. "But I am tired of running, tired of always being one step away from disaster. I want Lily to have stability, to be able to go to school and make friends and not have to worry about where our next meal is coming from." "That is a good thing to want," Xavier said quietly. Their eyes met across the table, and Xavier felt something shift inside him, that wall he had built crumbling a little more. Mary Harper was beautiful. He could see that now that she was cleaned up and warm, with fine features and large brown eyes that held both strength and vulnerability. But it was more than her looks that drew him. It was the way she held herself despite everything she had been through, the fierce protectiveness in her voice when she talked about Lily, the determination not to give up even when giving up would have been easier. Over the next few days, Xavier found reasons to stay in Custer. He told himself it was just to make sure Mary and Lily were all right, that they had everything they needed. He helped Mrs. Patterson with repairs around the boarding house, fixing a leaky roof, and replacing some rotted boards on the porch. He ran errands for Mary, picking up supplies from the general store and checking with the local newspaper to see if there were any job postings that might suit her skills. He taught Lily how to play poker with matchsticks instead of money, making her laugh for the first time since he had met her. And slowly, carefully, he and Mary began to talk. Not about anything deep at first, just small conversations over meals or while sitting on the porch in the brief afternoon warmth before the sun went down and the cold returned. Mary told him about growing up in Kansas, about her mother who had been a talented seamstress and her father who had worked at the grain elevator. Xavier told her about Montana, about the ranch where he had worked for 5 years before a falling out with the foreman had sent him on the road. He did not tell her about Emily, the woman he had almost married, or about the way his heart had broken when she chose his best friend instead. That was still too raw, too painful to put into words. But Mary seemed to sense there was pain in his past, just as he could sense the fear that still lingered in her eyes sometimes when a man's voice rose too loud, or when someone moved too quickly in her direction. They were both wounded in their own ways, both trying to figure out how to keep moving forward when the past kept pulling them back. A week after Xavier had found Mary in the woods, James Whitmore came to town with an envelope full of money and a message. Thomas had been sent back to Wyoming with instructions not to return until he had learned to control himself. And James wanted Mary to know that if she ever needed a reference for employment, he would provide one that made no mention of the incident with his son. It was not much, not nearly enough to make up for what had happened, but Mary accepted it with quiet dignity. That same day, the owner of the town's only restaurant, a German immigrant named Ernst Mueller, stopped by the boarding house looking for Mary. He had heard she was a good cook and wondered if she might be interested in working for him. The pay was not great, but it came with 1 meal a day, and Ernst promised she could bring Lily with her during working hours so the girl would not be left alone. Mary accepted on the spot, relief flooding her face. That evening, she and Xavier sat on the porch together after Lily had gone to bed, wrapped in blankets against the cold and watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "I can start saving money again," Mary said softly. "Maybe by spring I will have enough to rent a small place for Lily and me, something with 2 rooms so she can have her own space." "That sounds nice," Xavier said. "What about you?" Mary asked, turning to look at him. "How long are you planning to stay in Custer?" It was the question Xavier had been avoiding asking himself. He had intended to stay a few days at most, but those days had stretched into a week and he still felt no urge to move on. "I do not know," he said honestly. "I have been drifting for a while now, ever since things went bad in Montana. I figured I would just keep moving until I found a place that felt right, but nowhere ever did." "And Custer, does it feel right?" Xavier considered the question. Custer was small and unremarkable, the kind of town you pass through without a second thought. The winters were brutal, and the summers were hot and dusty, and there was not much to recommend it beyond decent people trying to make decent lives. But there was also Mary, with her determination and her kindness, and the way she smiled when Lily laughed. There was Lily herself, who had started to trust him enough to ask him to tell her stories before bed. There was Mrs. Patterson, who reminded him of his mother in the best ways. There was something here, something he had been missing without realizing it. "It is starting to," he said finally. Mary smiled, and even in the dim light from the windows behind them, Xavier could see the warmth in her expression. "Good," she said softly. "I am glad." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Mary reached over and took his hand. Her fingers were warm despite the cold, and Xavier felt his heart stutter in his chest. He looked down at their joined hands and then up at her face, and saw in her eyes the same hesitant hope he felt building in his own chest. "I know it has only been a week," Mary said quietly. "And I know I am probably being foolish, but I feel safe with you, Xavier. You are a good man, and those seem to be in short supply these days." "I do not know if I am that good," Xavier said, thinking of all his failures and regrets. "But I am trying to be." "That is all anyone can do," Mary said. "Try." Xavier lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture his mother had taught him years ago when he was learning how to court a girl properly. Mary's breath caught, and when he looked at her again, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I do not want to rush anything," he said. "You have been through a lot, and I do not want you to feel pressured or obligated because I helped you." "You are not pressuring me," Mary assured him. "If anything, I am worried I am the one rushing things. But life is short and uncertain, and I have learned the hard way that you have to grab hold of good things when you find them, because they might not be there tomorrow." Xavier understood that philosophy all too well. He had spent too much of his life being cautious, trying to do everything the right way, and it had not saved him from heartbreak. Maybe it was time to take a risk, to let himself feel something real instead of just drifting through life half numb. "Then let us take it one day at a time," he said. "No promises about forever, just see where this goes." Mary nodded, and they sat together under the stars until the cold became too much and they had to go inside. That night, Xavier lay in his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, feeling more alive than he had in months. The future was still uncertain, still full of questions he could not answer. But for the first time in a long time he felt like maybe, just maybe, things might work out all right. Winter settled over Custer with full force in the weeks that followed. Snow fell in heavy blankets that turned the town into a landscape of white and gray, and the temperature dropped so low that water froze in the buckets overnight. Mary started working at the restaurant, proving herself to be as capable as Ernst had hoped. She could cook anything, from traditional German dishes that reminded Ernst of home to hearty American fare that satisfied the cowboys and miners who came through town. Lily sat in the corner during working hours, practicing her letters on a slate that Xavier had bought her, and occasionally helping with simple tasks like folding napkins or sweeping the floor. Xavier found work as well, hiring on with a logging crew that was cutting timber in the hills for the spring building season. It was hard labor, the kind that left him exhausted and sore at the end of each day, but it paid decent money and gave him a reason to stay in town. He and Mary fell into a routine, seeing each other most evenings when their work was done, talking over dinner at the boarding house or taking short walks when the weather permitted. They learned each other slowly, carefully, sharing pieces of themselves in gradual increments. Mary told him about the aunt who had made her feel worthless, about the fear that she would never be able to provide properly for Lily, about her dreams of one day owning a small restaurant of her own where she could cook whatever she wanted. Xavier told her about his parents, both dead now, about the years he had spent learning the cattle business, about Emily and the way her rejection had sent him spiraling into a darkness he was only now beginning to climb out of. "You still love her?" Mary asked one night when they were sitting by the fire in the boarding house parlor. Lily was asleep upstairs and Mrs. Patterson had retired to her room, leaving them alone. Xavier thought about it, really thought about it, trying to be honest with himself as much as with Mary. "No," he said finally. "I do not think I do. I think I was in love with the idea of her, with the life I thought we would have together. But the real Emily, the woman who chose my best friend because he had more money and better prospects, I do not think I ever really knew her at all." That must have hurt terribly, Mary said softly. It did, Xavier admitted. But it also taught me something. It taught me that love is not about grand gestures or perfect moments. It is about showing up every day and choosing to stay even when things get hard. Emily did not choose me, and that was her right. But it also meant she was not the person I thought she was, and maybe that means we were not right for each other anyway. Mary reached over and took his hand, a gesture that had become familiar and comforting over the past weeks. I am glad she did not choose you, she said, because if she had, you would not have been riding through Custer the night I needed you most. Xavier smiled and brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles the way he always did now. I am glad too, he said. Christmas came and went, a quiet affair with a small tree in the boarding house parlor and modest gifts exchanged. Xavier gave Lily a new slate and a set of colored chalks, which made her squeal with delight. He gave Mary a warm shawl to replace the one she had lost, deep blue wool with embroidered edges that he had commissioned from the seamstress in town. Mary gave him a new pair of gloves that she had sewn herself, lined with soft rabbit fur to keep his hands warm during the cold logging work. They were the nicest gloves he had ever owned, and he wore them every day. The new year came, 1880 arriving with a blizzard that shut down the town for 3 days and left snowdrifts as high as the porch railings. When the storm finally cleared, Xavier and several other men spent hours digging out the main street and making sure the elderly residents of town had access to supplies and firewood. It was during this work that Xavier realized he had stopped thinking about moving on. Somewhere along the way, Custer had become home, and the people in it had become family. In February, Ernst Mueller offered Mary a raise and told her that, when the weather warmed up, he wanted to expand the restaurant, adding more tables and a bigger kitchen. He wanted Mary to manage the whole operation, which would mean more responsibility but also more money, and a chance to implement some of her own ideas. Mary accepted, her eyes shining with excitement, and that night she and Xavier celebrated with a bottle of wine that Mrs. Patterson had been saving for a special occasion. Things are really coming together, Mary said, her cheeks flushed from the wine and the warmth of the fire. For the first time since my parents died, I feel like maybe everything is going to be all right. It is, Xavier assured her. You have worked so hard and you deserve every good thing that comes your way. Mary set down her wine glass and looked at him seriously. Xavier, can I ask you something? Of course. What are we doing? She asked. I know we have been courting, or whatever the proper term is, but where is this going? Do you see a future here with me and Lily? Or are you still thinking about moving on eventually? Xavier had known this conversation was coming, had been thinking about it himself for weeks. The truth was that he had fallen in love with Mary Harper, slowly and thoroughly and completely. He loved her strength and her kindness, her determination and her vulnerability, the way she made him want to be a better man. He loved Lily too, the little girl who had been waiting in the cold and had somehow led him to the family he had not known he needed. I am not going anywhere, he said firmly. I am staying right here if you will have me. If I will have you, Mary laughed, a sound full of joy and relief. Xavier Emerson, I have been half in love with you since the day you brought me back from those woods. I have just been too scared to say it, too scared that you would realize you could do better and leave. Better, Xavier shook his head. Mary, you are the best thing that has happened to me in years. You and Lily both. I do not want better, I want this. I want you. He slid off the couch and onto one knee, taking her hand in his. He did not have a ring, had not planned this moment, but suddenly it felt absolutely right. Mary Harper, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you as happy as you make me? Mary's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling so wide it looked like her face might split. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, of course, yes." Xavier stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her for the first time. Her lips were soft and tasted like wine, and when she wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, he felt like he was finally, truly home. They told Lily the next morning over breakfast, and the little girl's reaction was everything they could have hoped for. She threw her arms around Xavier's waist and declared that she had always wanted a brother, and now she was getting one, which made both Mary and Xavier laugh. Mrs. Patterson cried happy tears and immediately started planning the wedding, insisting it should be in the spring when the weather was nicer, and the town could come together for a proper celebration. The engagement period was both wonderful and frustrating. Xavier wanted to marry Mary immediately, wanted to start their life together without delay, but propriety and Mrs. Patterson's insistence on a proper wedding meant waiting. They spent as much time together as work and weather allowed, and Xavier moved from the boarding house to a small cabin he rented on the edge of town, fixing it up to make it suitable for a family. It had 2 bedrooms, a main room with a fireplace, and a small kitchen that Mary declared perfect for her needs. Spring arrived slowly, the snow melting in patches to reveal brown earth and dead grass. As the days grew longer and warmer, the town came alive again. Merchants opened their doors wider, letting in fresh air. Children played in the streets, and preparations for Xavier and Mary's wedding kicked into high gear. They were married on a bright Saturday in late April, with most of the town gathered in the small church to witness their vows. Mary wore a simple white dress that the seamstress had made, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Lily was her bridesmaid, wearing a new dress of soft yellow that made her look like sunshine. Xavier wore his best suit, the one he had bought years ago for his almost wedding to Emily and had never worn. It felt right to finally use it for the wedding that was meant to be. The ceremony was short and sweet. The circuit preacher who came through Custer once a month reading from Scripture and leading them through their vows. When Xavier was told he could kiss his bride, he did so gently, reverently, very aware of the audience but not caring one bit. This was his wife, his partner, his future. Everything else was just background noise. The reception was held at Ernst's restaurant, which he had closed for the day to host the celebration. There was food and music, a fiddle player and a man with a squeeze box providing entertainment while people danced and laughed and celebrated. Xavier danced with Mary, holding her close and marveling at how much his life had changed in just 6 months. He danced with Lily, making her giggle by spinning her around until she was dizzy. He even danced with Mrs. Patterson, who told him that she had known from the first night that he and Mary were meant for each other. As the sun set and the party wound down, Xavier and Mary walked back to their cabin hand in hand, with Lily skipping ahead of them. The little girl had been told she could stay at the boarding house for the first few nights of the marriage to give Xavier and Mary some privacy. But she wanted to see the cabin one more time before going back with Mrs. Patterson. The cabin looked warm and welcoming in the evening light, smoke curling from the chimney where Xavier had laid a fire that morning. Inside, everything was neat and clean, ready for them to start their life together. Lily ran from room to room, exclaiming over details she had seen a dozen times before, her excitement making Xavier and Mary smile. "You will come see me tomorrow, right?" Lily asked Mary anxiously when it was time for her to leave. "Of course," Mary assured her, pulling her sister into a tight hug. "Every single day, you are still my sister and I will always be here for you." "And Xavier too," Lily looked at him hopefully. "And Xavier too," he confirmed, ruffling her hair. "You are stuck with both of us now." Satisfied, Lily let Mrs. Patterson lead her back toward town, waving over her shoulder until she disappeared around a bend in the road. Xavier closed the door and turned to find Mary watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "What is it?" he asked. "I am just happy," she said simply. "Happier than I ever thought I could be." Xavier crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, holding her close and breathing in the scent of her hair. "Me too," he said softly. "Me too." That night, they came together as husband and wife, tentatively at first and then with growing confidence and passion. Mary was inexperienced, having saved herself for marriage the way respectable girls were expected to. But she was eager to learn, and Xavier was patient and gentle, showing her the pleasures that could be found in the marriage bed. They made love by firelight, learning each other's bodies the way they had learned each other's hearts, with care and attention and growing joy. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilts, Mary's head on Xavier's chest and his arms wrapped around her. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Xavier replied, meaning it with everything he had. The months that followed were good ones, full of work and laughter and the simple pleasures of domestic life. Mary thrived in her role managing Ernst's expanded restaurant, implementing new dishes and systems that made the business more profitable than it had ever been. Ernst was so pleased that he gave her a percentage of the profits, which meant more money for the growing nest egg Mary was building toward her dream of owning her own place someday. Xavier continued working with the logging crew through the summer, then transitioned to ranch work in the fall when one of the larger spreads needed extra hands for the cattle drive. The money was good, and the work was familiar, and he was able to come home to Mary most nights, which was all that mattered. Lily started school that fall, joining the dozen other children who gathered in the one-room schoolhouse on the edge of town. She was bright and eager to learn, quickly becoming one of the teacher's favorite students. She still spent time at the cabin with Mary and Xavier, usually having dinner with them several nights a week and staying over on weekends. The arrangement worked well for everyone, giving Lily stability and education while still keeping the family close. In December, Mary realized she was pregnant. She told Xavier one evening after dinner, her hands shaking slightly as she took his and placed them on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby," she said, her voice full of wonder and a little bit of fear. Xavier felt his heart expand in his chest, filling with a joy so intense it was almost painful. A baby. Their baby. A new life that they had created together out of love and hope. "When?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "June, I think," Mary said. "Early summer." Xavier pulled her into his arms and held her tight, his mind already racing ahead to all the things they would need to do to prepare. They would need a cradle and baby clothes and more space eventually as the child grew. But all of that could be figured out. Right now, all that mattered was that his wife was carrying their child and they were going to be parents. The pregnancy was not easy. Mary suffered from sickness in the early months that left her pale and weak, barely able to keep down food. Xavier did what he could to help, taking over the cooking and cleaning when he was home and hiring a girl from town to assist Mary at the restaurant on days when she was feeling particularly poorly. By the 4th month, the sickness had passed, but Mary was exhausted all the time, falling asleep in her chair after dinner and needing to rest frequently during the day. "I feel useless," she complained one evening, frustrated by her own limitations. "You are growing a whole human being inside you," Xavier reminded her gently. "That is not useless, that is miraculous." Mary smiled despite herself. "I suppose when you put it that way it does sound rather impressive." As winter gave way to spring and spring to early summer, Mary's belly grew round and full. She had to stop working at the restaurant in May, too tired and too uncomfortable to be on her feet all day. Ernst was understanding, telling her the position would be waiting for her whenever she was ready to return, and in the meantime, he hired a temporary replacement. Xavier cut back on his own work, wanting to be close to home as Mary's due date approached. He took on odd jobs around town that allowed him to check on her frequently, fixing fences and mucking out stables, and doing general labor that needed doing but was not tied to any particular schedule. In mid-June, Mary went into labor. It started in the early morning, gentle contractions that Mary thought were just the false labor pains she had been experiencing for weeks. But as the day wore on, the contractions grew stronger and closer together, and by evening there was no doubt that the baby was coming. Xavier sent for the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Chen, who had delivered half the babies in Custer over the past decade. She arrived quickly and took charge of the situation, banishing Xavier from the bedroom and enlisting Mrs. Patterson and Lily to help with the labor. Xavier paced in the main room, listening to Mary's cries from the bedroom and feeling completely helpless. This was not something he could fix with his hands or solve with determination. All he could do was wait and pray that Mary and the baby would both come through safely. The labor lasted through the night and into the next morning, long hours during which Xavier aged years. Finally, just as the sun was rising, he heard a new sound, the thin, wailing cry of a newborn baby. His heart leaped into his throat and he rushed to the bedroom door, waiting anxiously for news. Mrs. Chen emerged a few minutes later, smiling broadly. "You have a son, Mr. Emerson, a big, healthy boy with excellent lungs, and your wife is tired but doing well." Xavier nearly collapsed with relief. A son, he had a son. "Can I see them?" he asked. "Give us a few minutes to get things cleaned up, and then yes, of course," Mrs. Chen said. Those few minutes felt like hours, but finally, Mrs. Patterson opened the bedroom door and beckoned him inside. Mary was propped up in bed, looking exhausted but radiant, with a small bundle wrapped in blankets cradled in her arms. Xavier approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe, and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that were squeezed shut against the bright world he had just entered. He was perfect. Absolutely, completely perfect. "You want to hold him?" Mary asked softly. Xavier nodded, not trusting his voice, and carefully took the baby into his arms. The weight was almost nothing, but it felt like holding the entire world. This tiny person was his son, his child, a part of him and Mary that would go on into the future. The responsibility was staggering, but so was the love he felt, instant and overwhelming and fiercer than anything he had ever experienced. "What should we name him?" Mary asked. They had discussed names during the pregnancy but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking down at his son's face, Xavier knew exactly what felt right. "Samuel," he said. "Samuel James Emerson, after both our fathers." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "That is perfect," she whispered. Xavier spent the next hour sitting beside the bed, holding his son and watching Mary rest. Lily came in eventually, wide-eyed and awed by the baby, and Xavier let her sit beside him while he explained about being a big sister and all the responsibilities that came with it. Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Chen fussed around, making sure Mary had everything she needed and that the baby was feeding properly. As the morning stretched into afternoon, and the initial excitement began to fade into the reality of new parenthood, Xavier felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. This was what he had been searching for during all those months of drifting, this sense of purpose and belonging. He had a wife he loved, a son to raise, a sister-in-law who looked up to him, and a community that had embraced him as one of their own. The early months of Samuel's life were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. The baby woke frequently at night to nurse, leaving both Xavier and Mary sleep-deprived and short-tempered. But there were also moments of pure joy. Samuel's first smile, the way he would grip Xavier's finger with his tiny hand, the contented sounds he made when Mary held him. Mary recovered well from the birth, and by late summer she was starting to talk about returning to work at the restaurant, at least part-time. Ernst was eager to have her back, the temporary replacement not having the same skill or creativity that Mary brought to the kitchen. They worked out an arrangement where Mary would work 3 days a week, and Mrs. Patterson would watch Samuel during those hours along with Lily when school was not in session. Xavier continued with ranch work, now driven by the need to provide for his growing family rather than just make enough to get by. He was good at what he did, reliable and hardworking, and the ranch owner offered him a permanent position with better pay than the temporary work he had been doing. Xavier accepted gladly, grateful for the stability. Life settled into a rhythm, the days marked by work and family dinners and the small milestones of Samuel's growth. He learned to roll over, then to sit up, then to crawl, each new skill celebrated as if he was the first baby in the world to accomplish such feats. Lily adored him, playing with him for hours and helping Mary with his care. She was 12 now, growing into a capable young woman who was already talking about becoming a teacher when she was old enough. 2 years passed, then 3. Samuel grew from a baby into a toddler, walking and talking and getting into everything with the fearless curiosity of a small child. Mary returned to work full-time at the restaurant, and Xavier was promoted to foreman at the ranch, managing a crew of cowboys and overseeing the daily operations. They were doing well financially, better than either of them had dared hope when they first arrived in Custer as desperate strangers. In the spring of 1883, Mary told Xavier she was pregnant again. The news was both exciting and nerve-wracking, knowing the challenges that came with pregnancy and childbirth. But Samuel had been such a joy that they could not help but look forward to expanding their family. This pregnancy was easier than the first, Mary not suffering from the same debilitating sickness. She worked almost until her due date in October, finally stopping only when her belly made it too difficult to move around the kitchen efficiently. The labor, when it came, was faster than Samuel's had been, only 6 hours from start to finish. This time, they had a daughter, tiny and perfect with wispy blonde hair and eyes that would eventually turn the same brown as Mary's. They named her Grace, and she became the darling of the family. Samuel, now 3 years old, was fascinated by his little sister, wanting to help with everything from feeding to diaper changes. Lily, 15 now and increasingly independent, still made time to dote on the new baby. And Xavier found that loving a daughter was different from loving a son, softer somehow, more protective. The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranching and family life. Samuel started school, proving to be as bright as Lily had been at his age. Grace grew from a baby to a little girl with a stubborn streak and a laugh that could light up a room. Lily graduated from school and, true to her childhood dream, began working as the assistant teacher, with plans to take over when the current teacher retired. In 1886, Mary finally achieved her long-held dream of opening her own restaurant. Ernst had decided to retire and offered to sell her his establishment at a price she could afford with the money she had been saving for years. The restaurant became Mary's domain, a place where she could implement all her ideas and create the kind of welcoming atmosphere she had always envisioned. It was hard work, but she loved every minute of it, and the restaurant quickly became the most popular eating establishment in Custer. Xavier continued working at the ranch, now second in command to the owner and responsible for major decisions about herd management and grazing lands. The work was demanding but rewarding, and he took pride in being good at what he did. The ranch prospered under his management, and his wages reflected his value to the operation. They were happy. Not perfect, there were still hard times and arguments and moments of doubt, but fundamentally, deeply happy. They had built a life together from nothing, and it was a good life, full of love and purpose and community. One evening in the spring of 1888, 9 years after Xavier had first ridden into Custer and found a small girl waiting in the cold, the family gathered for dinner at the cabin that had long since been expanded to accommodate their growing needs. Lily was there with her new husband, a quiet ranch hand named Robert who clearly adored her. Samuel, now 8, was chattering about something that had happened at school. Grace, 5 years old, was helping Mary set the table with the serious concentration she brought to everything she did. Xavier sat at the head of the table, watching his family with a fullness in his heart that felt almost too much to contain. Mary caught his eye and smiled, that same warm smile that had captured him from the beginning, and he smiled back. After dinner, when the children were playing outside and Lily and Robert had gone home, Xavier and Mary sat on the porch together watching the sunset. It had become their ritual over the years, these quiet moments at the end of the day when they could just be together. "Do you ever think about that night?" Mary asked. "The night you found Lily waiting outside the general store?" "All the time," Xavier admitted. "I think about how easily I could have ridden right past without seeing her, or seen her and decided it was not my problem. My whole life could be completely different." "Mine too," Mary said softly. "If you had not come looking for me, I do not know what would have happened. I might have frozen to death in those woods, or made it to town eventually but been too late to help Lily. Everything good in my life now stems from that one night." Xavier took her hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "I used to think I was unlucky in love," he said. "That Emily choosing someone else meant I was destined to be alone, but now I see it differently. Everything that happened, all the heartbreak and disappointment, it was leading me to Custer, to you, and I would go through it all again, every painful moment, if it meant ending up right here." Mary leaned her head on his shoulder. "I love you, Xavier Emerson. I love you too, Mary Emerson." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Inside the cabin, they could hear the children's laughter, Grace shrieking with delight as Samuel chased her around the main room. It was the sound of home, of family, of a life well lived. The years ahead would bring more changes, more challenges, more joys and sorrows. Samuel would grow up to take over management of the ranch eventually, continuing the work his father had started. Grace would surprise everyone by becoming a doctor, traveling back east for medical school, and then returning to Custer to serve her community. Lily and Robert would have 4 children of their own, filling the town with another generation of family. Mary's restaurant would become a landmark, a place where people gathered for good food and good company. She would pass it on to Grace's eldest daughter eventually, keeping it in the family. Xavier would work at the ranch until his hair turned gray and his joints ached, finally retiring at 65 to spend his days helping Mary in the restaurant and playing with grandchildren. They would grow old together, Xavier and Mary, their love deepening and strengthening with each passing year. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Xavier would take Mary back to the spot where he had found her in the woods all those years ago, now marked by a small cairn of stones they had placed there as a memorial to how their story began. He would pull her close and thank her again for choosing him, for building this life with him, for being his partner in every way that mattered. And when they were both very old, their children grown and their grandchildren starting families of their own, they would sit on that same porch where they had sat so many evenings before, holding hands and watching the sunset. Mary would rest her head on Xavier's shoulder, and he would wrap his arm around her, and they would both know that they had been extraordinarily blessed. But all of that was still to come. On this spring evening in 1888, they were still relatively young, their children still small, their future still unwritten. They sat together on the porch and watched the stars emerge one by one, the same stars that had been shining the night Xavier found Lily waiting in the cold. Those stars had witnessed the beginning of their story, and they would witness all the chapters still to come. Inside, Samuel called for his father to come settle a dispute with Grace about whose turn it was to choose the bedtime story. Xavier squeezed Mary's hand once more and then stood, heading inside to fulfill his duties as a father. Mary followed, and together they herded the children through the evening routine of washing up and getting into nightclothes and climbing into bed. Xavier read the story that night, a tale about a brave knight and a clever princess, while Samuel and Grace listened with rapt attention. Mary sat in the doorway, watching her family with contentment written across her face. When the story was finished and the children were tucked in, Xavier kissed each of them on the forehead and whispered that he loved them. Later, in their own bedroom, Xavier and Mary prepared for sleep. They had shared this room, this bed, for 9 years now, and the intimacy between them was comfortable and deep. They made love that night, slowly and tenderly, reaffirming the bond that held them together. Afterward they lay in each other's arms, Mary's head on Xavier's chest and his hand stroking her hair. "Thank you," Mary whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Xavier asked. "For everything. For finding Lily that night, for bringing me home, for loving me, for giving me this life." "For all of it." Xavier tightened his arms around her. "I am the one who should be thanking you. You gave me a reason to stop running, a place to call home. You gave me a family and a purpose and a love I did not think I would ever find. Everything good in my life started the night I met you." Mary tilted her head up and kissed him softly. "Then we are both lucky." "Luckiest people alive," Xavier agreed. They fell asleep that way, wrapped around each other, safe and warm and loved. Outside, the wind whispered through the pine trees and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, marking the passage of time. Custer slept, a small town in the vast Dakota territory, home to ordinary people living ordinary lives. But for Xavier and Mary Emerson, there was nothing ordinary about it. Their life together was extraordinary, built on a foundation of chance and choice and love that had grown stronger with every passing day. The story that began with a child waiting in the cold and a cowboy who stopped to ask who she was waiting for had become something neither of them could have predicted. It had become a marriage, a family, a legacy that would extend far beyond their own lives. It had become home. And as they slept, peaceful and content, the future stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility. There would be challenges ahead. No life was without them, but they would face those challenges together, just as they had faced everything else. They were partners in the truest sense, two people who had found each other when they both needed it most, and had chosen to build something beautiful out of that chance meeting. The cabin was silent now, except for the crackling of embers in the fireplace and the soft breathing of sleeping children. Moonlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the simple furniture and the small touches that made this house a home. Mary's embroidered samplers on the walls, Xavier's boots by the door, the children's toys scattered across the floor. It was not grand or impressive, but it was theirs, every inch of it earned through hard work and determination and love. In the years to come, when people in Custer told the story of Xavier and Mary Emerson, they would talk about the restaurant Mary built and the success Xavier found at the ranch. They would mention the children, who grew up to be fine citizens, and the grandchildren who brought joy to the entire community. But those who knew them best would talk about something else, about the quiet devotion in the way Xavier looked at his wife, about the gentle strength Mary showed in everything she did, about the love that radiated from them and touched everyone around them. It was a love story worthy of the ballads sung in saloons and the tales told around campfires, but it was also something more real and lasting than any song or story. It was the kind of love that endured through hardship and celebrated through joy, that grew deeper with familiarity rather than fading with time. It was the kind of love that changed lives, not just for Xavier and Mary, but for everyone who knew them. And it all started with a simple question asked by a cowboy to a child waiting in the cold on a November night in 1879. "Who were you waiting for out here?" That question had led to a search, and that search had led to a rescue, and that rescue had led to a courtship, and that courtship had led to a marriage, and that marriage had led to this. A life full of love and purpose and meaning. As the night deepened and the moon climbed higher in the sky, Custer settled into the peaceful quiet of a small town at rest. In the Emerson cabin, Xavier stirred in his sleep and pulled Mary closer, even in unconsciousness seeking her warmth and presence. Mary sighed contentedly and nestled deeper into his embrace, her hand finding his and holding on tight. They were home. They were together. They were loved and they loved in return. And in the end, that was all that really mattered. The journey that had brought them to this moment had been long and difficult, marked by loss and hardship and uncertainty. But every step had been worth it, because it had led them to each other. The stars continued their slow wheel overhead, bearing witness as they had for countless generations and would for countless more to come. They had seen empires rise and fall, had watched humanity struggle and triumph, and struggle again. But they had also seen moments like this. Two people finding each other against all odds, building a life together, creating something beautiful and lasting out of love and determination. Xavier Emerson had ridden into Custer looking for nothing more than a place to sleep and a hot meal. Instead, he had found his destiny in the form of a frightened child and her brave sister. He had found purpose in protecting them, joy in loving them, and meaning in building a life alongside them. He had found home. Mary Harper had come to South Dakota desperate and afraid, trying to build a future for herself and her sister with nothing but determination and hope. Instead, she had found safety in the arms of a kind cowboy, love in his gentle strength, and partnership in their shared dreams. She had found home. And Lily, the child who had waited all night in the cold, had found family. She had watched her sister fall in love, had been embraced by Xavier as a brother would embrace a sister, had grown up surrounded by the kind of love and stability she had feared was lost to her forever. She had found home. Three people, brought together by chance and choice, who had created something far greater than the sum of their individual parts. They had created family, community, legacy. They had created love that would echo down through generations, influencing children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren in ways they could not begin to imagine. The story that began on that cold November night would be told and retold, becoming part of the history of Custer, South Dakota. It would be simplified and romanticized, as all stories are when they pass from fact into legend. But at its core, it would remain true. A story about kindness and courage, about taking chances and making choices, about the transformative power of love. As dawn began to break over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the Emerson household began to stir. Samuel woke first, as he usually did, and padded into the kitchen looking for breakfast. Grace followed shortly after, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Xavier and Mary woke to the sound of their children's voices, smiling at each other in the gray morning light before rising to face another day. It was an ordinary morning in an ordinary town, but it was also extraordinary in all the ways that mattered. It was a morning filled with love and laughter, with the simple pleasures of family and the profound satisfaction of a life well lived. It was a morning that proved that sometimes the best stories are not about grand adventures or dramatic heroics, but about ordinary people who choose to be kind, who choose to love, who choose to build something beautiful out of the raw materials of everyday life. Xavier made coffee while Mary started breakfast, working together with the easy coordination of long partnership. Samuel set the table while Grace fetched eggs from the chicken coop. It was a routine they had followed hundreds of times before and would follow hundreds of times again, but there was comfort in that routine, security in knowing what came next and who would be there to share it. As they sat down to breakfast together, Xavier looked around the table at his family and felt that familiar swell of gratitude. 9 years ago, he had been alone and adrift, nursing a broken heart and wondering if he would ever find his place in the world. Now he was surrounded by love, by people who depended on him and people he depended on in return. He had purpose and meaning, and a future that stretched out bright and full of promise. Mary caught his eye across the table and smiled, and in that smile, Xavier saw everything they had been through together, every trial and triumph, every moment of joy and sorrow. He saw the girl he had rescued from the woods, the woman who had become his wife, the mother of his children, his partner in all things. He saw his past, his present, and his future, all wrapped up in one beloved face. And he smiled back, pouring all his love and gratitude and hope into that simple expression. No words were needed. They had long since learned to communicate in glances and touches and the comfortable silence of true understanding. She knew what he was thinking, just as he knew what she was thinking. They were thinking the same thing they thought every morning when they woke up together and every evening when they went to sleep side by side. They were thinking how lucky they were, how blessed, how grateful. They were thinking about the long road that had brought them to this moment and the longer road that stretched ahead. They were thinking about the love they shared and the family they had built and the life they were living, one ordinary, extraordinary day at a time. After breakfast, Xavier headed to the ranch and Mary to the restaurant, while the children went off to school. It was the rhythm of their weekdays, each person going about their work, contributing to the family and the community in their own way. And at the end of the day, they would all come back together, gathering around the dinner table to share food and stories and laughter. This was the life Xavier and Mary had chosen, the life they had fought for and built together. It was not always easy. There were still hard days and difficult moments, but it was theirs, and that made it precious beyond measure. They had taken the broken pieces of their individual lives and fit them together into something whole and beautiful. They had created a family, a home, a love that would last as long as they both lived and beyond. And it all started with a simple act of kindness on a cold November night when a cowboy stopped to ask a child who she was waiting for. That question had changed everything. setting in motion a chain of events that would affect not just Xavier and Mary and Lily, but generations to come. It was a reminder that small actions can have profound consequences, that a single moment of compassion can ripple outward in ways we can never fully predict or understand. As the sun climbed higher in the sky and the day settled into its familiar patterns, Custer went about its business. Cowboys rode out to tend cattle, miners headed into the hills, merchants opened their shops, and families went about the work of living. It was just another day in just another small town in the American West, unremarkable in all the ways that history would remember. But for Xavier and Mary Emerson, it was another day of the life they had built together, and that made it remarkable indeed. It was another day to love and be loved, to work and to rest, to face challenges and to celebrate victories. It was another day to be grateful for the chance encounter that had brought them together, and the choice they had made to build a life as partners. The story that began with a child waiting in the cold had become a story about family and love, and the courage it takes to open your heart after it has been broken. It had become a story about second chances and new beginnings, about finding home in unexpected places and with unexpected people. It had become a story about the best parts of human nature: kindness, compassion, determination, and love. And as the sun set that evening, marking the end of another day and the beginning of another night, Xavier and Mary sat on their porch once more, holding hands and watching the stars emerge. They sat in comfortable silence, needing no words to express what they felt. They simply sat together, two people who had found each other when they needed it most and had chosen to build something beautiful and lasting out of that chance meeting. This was their happily ever after, not perfect or without challenge, but real and true and full of love. This was the life they had earned, the life they had chosen, the life they would continue to build together for all the days they had left. And as they sat beneath the stars that had witnessed the beginning of their story, they knew with absolute certainty that they would face whatever came next together, just as they had faced everything else, hand in hand, heart to heart, for as long as they both lived, this was home.